Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is Eric Johnston. Have any of you ever wondered what it would be like to fly the A-4 Skyhawk? Well, this is our opportunity to listen to 4 individuals that flew both the A-4 and the TA-4, both in training command as well as combat in Vietnam. We hope you'll enjoy the video.
My name's Jack Ashmore. I'm Captain, U.S. Navy, retired many years ago. I probably ended up with about 3,000 hours in the A-4 all total. In my career, I had 886 carrier landings, successfully, I might say. Obviously, I wouldn't be here talking about it. My feeling on the A-4 is I made 3 tours in it, and I think it's probably the best combat airplane that the Navy ever built. By that I mean it would sustain damage like no other airplane that we had at the time would do and still get you home. I had airplanes come back with holes all over them, holes in the wings, pieces shot off of them, and they still came back aboard and landed. So they were very successful in that fact. Now, of course, anything that you go to war in and it brings you home, you're going to love anyhow, but I have a particular fond spot. I started off in the Navy in the Korean War. I was flying AD Sky Raiders, and after that went into training command. We finally in the Navy decided to get jets, and I got in on a nucleus of the varsity there and ended up flying T-28s and TV-2s down in Beeville, Texas for a couple of 3 years. And of course, being an attack pilot and with some jet time, as soon as I went back to fleet, I'm flying A-4s. Which I dearly loved. During my tour, I had a chance to fly the A-7 some. I flew the Phantom some. So I had a little bit of time in most everything that we had in the Navy then. I finished up a cruise on the Coral Sea, was one of my first, and then made 2 other cruises on the USS Ranger, which I dearly loved, good ship, which we've sold for scrap now, which breaks your heart. I can remember making the maiden voyage to Westpac on the USS Ranger in 1960, and to see him tow it down to Corpus Christi to be melted down and sold kind of rubbed against your soul a little. But that's the way things go. The modern day airplane now is more of a flying computer than anything else. We didn't even have autopilots in the A-4, so that was something new and innovative, I thought, when we got into modern day airplanes.
My name is Mike Richardson. I was in the Marine Corps from 1966 through 1973. I flew 5 years of active duty. Started flying in October of 1969. I had arrived in Vietnam as a VMCJ pilot flying the EA-6. I wasn't seeing enough action. We would fly up in North Vietnam supporting all the Alpha strikes, but we weren't armed. And it really wasn't the kind of action I really wanted to see. So there's an opportunity for me to transfer to HAMS 11 to fly the TA-4s, a high-speed FAC in Laos. So that's what I did. Got a combat checkout in A-4s. I'd never been in an A-4 in my life. And basically it was the attitude, if you had wings on your chest and you were a pilot, you could fly anything. They basically shared the owner's manual with me, went through a few of the switches, strapped me in, and off we went. I flew about 25 missions in the back seat, being trained in the mission. And after I was trained, I was designated a Tactical Air Controller Airborne, Fast Vac. I was designated Playboy 21. And that was the call sign I always used when I was pilot in command. The call sign was Playboy 21.
I'm Jim Hudson. I'm the Executive Director of the Fort Worth Aviation Museum. I'm also Chairman of the Board of the OV-10 Bronco Association. The A-4 I flew a couple of different times in the Marine Corps. One was when I was a student. The A-4 was used as the advanced jet trainer during that period of time, which for me was in 1972. After I got my wings, I flew the OV-10s for about 3 years, and then I went back to the training command, and I was an advanced jet instructor in the TA-4 at NAS Kingsville in a squadron called VT-22. Down there, we used the airplane for basic instruction, for airway navigation, and then for things like advanced training in formation, air-to-ground weapons, air-to-air weapons, aerial navigation, things like that. And so I was essentially an attack instructor because of my FAC background.
One time, my operations officer, Bob Vesna, came back and he had a hole in the wing of the airplane that was actually big enough for him to stand in. Of course, you know, the wing of the A-4 is all a fuel tank, and you've got, of course, that 90-gallon tank behind the pilot. And since in battle we never carried fuel tanks, we carried bombs, we relied on tankers to get him home, but he got home all right, and we eventually flew that thing into Cuby Point and got it fixed, had a wing change on it. But that was one. We had numerous others. I had the nose of mine clipped off one time over Kep Airfield and managed to fly it home. It wiggled a little, but there again, you ingest stuff down the tanks, and then the old engine would run rough and rattle and shake and roll, but it always got you home. Loved that J52, J65 before that, but J52, good engine.
All right, so here we are in front of headquarters with the A-4 Mighty Mike, and this was one of 4 A-4 Mikes that was stationed at NAS Dallas as an Adversary aircraft. And Dallas was unique in that we had an operational maintenance division that had 4 aircraft actually assigned to the station and not part of a squadron. The Mike is pretty interesting because it has a big bubble canopy on here. It had a self-starting unit. It had an F4 drag chute, and you could land this thing in 1,500 feet if you used the F4 drag chute, which I did several times for maintenance. And that's pretty much about the same thing you're going to get with a field arrestment. It was stripped down with the hump. Anything we could take off, we took off. It had a HUD in there, which we no longer had any use for. And we got it down to 10,500 pounds on the empty weight, with a P408 engine on it that had 11,200 pounds of thrust on there. That made it pretty good. So back in the day when you were fighting the F4 or the A4, the F-14s, they could go vertical, and that worked pretty well until you got the big engines, and then you could just shoot them at the top of a loop. So that energy disadvantage for the A4 went away.
I was telling about it. We had a procedure, it was called a nickel-dime patch that they could throw on in a hurry. And you get small arms fire all through the fuselage, wing, where it happened to be. And my crew would go out and put a nickel-dime patch, they called it. And they put a little thing riveted inside and then cut a patch just the size of the hole, put it on there, and actually you could hardly tell what happened except for the rivets around it. Anyhow, then they'd paint that with some stuff that's called red lead, or Petratech, whatever they want to call it, red lead, to keep any corrosion from the new metal. Had little splotches all over it. CO, the ship, Captain Livingston, called me at one time and said, "Your airplanes look like they got the measles." Had little red dots all over them. Of course, when we went into Cuby Point, we could get them all repainted and it looked more like airplanes again. But yeah, this airplane would take all kinds of damage and fly you home. I really loved it. That was one my ops officer had the hole in the wing. He could actually stand up and put his arms out through the hole in the wing. His name is Bob Vesna. He's the operations officer, super pilot. We figure either a 57 or 85 went through the wing and didn't explode. That happened. When I got hit in the nose, I think it was at 85 hit that, but You know, what was funny, those were things, or VT fuel, usually if it got within so many 100 feet, it'd go off, or contact. Well, this one obviously got within in the distance and also hit the airplane, didn't go boom. So, you know, otherwise you'd say, thank you, Lord, I'm here. But yeah, the airplane just seemed to withstand anything you wanted to throw at it. Love it, every minute of it.
It was exciting. It was demanding. I think one thing I might have mentioned or did not is that we were all volunteers. There was no regular replacement pilots to be a Playboy FAC. You had to want to be a Playboy FAC, and you had to pass the test to get in it. It wasn't open to just anyone. You had to have the right attitude. You had to want to take the fight to the enemy, and that's who they were looking for. Basically, it was again, it was demanding, and therefore, but there's no place I wanted to be. After I'd flown for a while, I just absolutely loved the mission. But we would fly up and down the Chi Minh Trail at 400 feet. Sometimes we'd be down real at treetop level. We'd be at 400 knots. And it was our job to interdict all the supplies coming down the Chi Minh Trail. We would look for troops, trucks, road repair crews, and we were always worried about gun positions. Guns were always a problem. We got shot at almost every day. If we saw it or we didn't see it, we knew we were being shot at. And sometimes it was funny because the guys would come back and said, hey Joe, how'd you do? And I said, nah, we didn't see a thing. And they said, what are those holes in your tail? Oh crap, you know, and you take hits, maybe depending on where the hits were, you wouldn't even know you took them. The A-4 was a great airplane for battle damage. Even though it was a single engine airplane, it was amazing the type of battle damage the A-4 would take and still bring you home. I love that airplane. You could lose a lot of system. As long as your engine kept running, you were going to keep flying, as long as you had your wings.
There are always stories in the training command about things that students do. The thing that came to my mind the most, though, were a couple of incidents. One of them was that the bad students weren't going to get you in trouble because you were always watching them. It was the good students who would get you in trouble. And I learned that the first time when we were coming back into the field and we were doing just a normal instrument approach. I was in the front seat of the airplane while the student was in the back under the bag flying. And I was just kind of relaxed, taking in the view, and then all of a sudden realized that the ground was above me. And the student had lost sight of what he was doing. He lost his scan in the back seat and started to roll the airplane over when we were dirtying on approach. And so that was my first wake-up call, that you never relaxed with a student in the airplane ever. You know, so that was one of the things that took place. I had another incident at one point that I've always found interesting, and a demonstration of how fast the airplane would roll. We would oftentimes on formation flights take some of the enlisted people along so that they'd have an opportunity as a reward for the work that they had done and things to go fly an airplane. In the airplane, we would put these people in the back seat of the airplane, and we would normally have the intercom communication between the front and the back seat would always be on what we refer to as hot mic, which meant that the person in the back didn't have to press any buttons, you just heard everything that they said. Well, this one particular person I had in the back seat one day was kind of hyperventilating about this ride in these airplanes, and I'm out there with a 4-ship. I'm leading a 4-ship of airplanes. So I've got 3 students with me, and I'm the only instructor leading this flight. And this fellow in the back seat is getting hyperventilating, and all I'm hearing is him breathing. And so I asked him, I said, do you see that switch up in front of the stick that says hot and cold? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, what I want you to do is reach up there and move the switch from hot to cold, meaning that I wanted to turn off of his mic. So what he did is he reached up, pushed the stick over, grabbed the switch and turned it off. So luckily he pushed us away from the formation, because the airplane had rolled 720 degrees per second. And so all of a sudden here we are spinning off off the earth because of this guy moving the stick. He didn't realize what he was doing in that particular case. So you know, that was just one of the many incidences.
The A-4 was designed as a nuclear bomber, so that's why it sits so high off the ground. It had a big nuke that was underneath, and it's been a host of an enormous amount of missions besides the Blue Angels and the training command using that, and a bomber and Adversary airplane, what we used it for. We also had other target towing missions that we would use. There were missiles that we would launch off of here for targets. There was Sea Whiz, which is your 20 millimeters on board the ships with automatic radar tracking. I would tow a target with them occasionally that went out 5 miles behind you. You actually had 30,000 feet of cable in. That was with a big target that carried its own transponder, so they didn't lock onto the wrong target. But this airplane was never replaced with anything that could do as many roles as it did.
The Navy and the carrier Air Force, we were all up in the North Vietnam, north of the DMZ, what they call the DMZ area. They were route packs, they call them, 1, 2, and 3 up there. The further north you went, the smaller the number. It went all the way up to the Chinese border and down to the DMZ. Of course, we bordered on the west side by Laos, but that's where all of our stuff was. And we'd go out to all kinds of, you get little convoy trucks. Everyone's going to find something like that. But big thing everybody loved to get was what we call alpha targets. That's one like a big fuel farm, or we went into Haiphong Harbor and tore up their shipbuilding facility one time. But that was the type of target you really loved to get. You felt like you were doing some good.
Well, basically, it was one of those days that nothing happened. You know, sometimes you'd go on the trail, you didn't see anything, you didn't see any trucks, and it was kind of boring. We were a little off the beaten trail. I was right at the corner of North Vietnam and Laos. We were just trying to go to a different area to see what we could see. I remember commenting to the guy in the front, I was flying the back seat at that point, said, hey, it was a slow day, we're almost bingo fuel, let's go home. The aircraft was hit by AAA, the aircraft lurched, there was smoke, there was debris in the cockpit, and we knew we'd been hit, and we'd been hit hard. We were at some place we weren't ordinarily flying, so it was my job to get the Mayday call out. And I'll never forget thinking, as I gathered my breath and tried to calm down just a second, my eyes certainly went to the instruments to make sure everything was still turning, and I said, well, how would John Wayne do this? Because as I told Eric, I said, if you were going to die, you were going to die, but you sure didn't want to sound bad when you did it. So fortunately, the radios were shot out. I know the control cables were partially frayed and the aircraft was hurting, but nobody heard my Mayday call. So we just, the airplane kept flying, so we headed for home. The transponder worked, we put out the emergency call, all the crash crews met us when we landed back in Da Nang, but it turned out to be an uneventful day, other than the metal damage.
We would go out as instructors. We would take students out to the boat, drop them off, and then they would get in the pattern and make their touch and go landings or their arrested landings. And then when they were finished, they would take off for the last time and they would join up on an instructor pilot who was overhead. And so we called them angels. So we would be angels in the flight. We'd drop off students, we'd go pick up a position. If we needed to, we'd land and get gas and then go back up and escort students to and from the boat. It was always a big deal for the students, especially in the A-4, because the airplane was, it wasn't difficult, but it was real sporting around the boat. It tended to bounce and things like that. Well, I'll never forget one time when we were out there, a kid had, a student, not a kid, we were all kids, but the student had come around and I was hearing from the LSO, the landing signal officer is yelling, power, power, wave off, and this student had gotten very low and had sheared the gear off on the end of the carrier and had managed to get the airplane back up into the air. And he came up and he was directed to join on me, and he came up and joined on my wing. And so here's this A-4, and we flew them much like one of the ones we have here with drop tanks on them. And that was intentional in the training command, because if you had to do a gear up landing, you could set the airplane down on the tanks, they replaced the tanks, the airplane would be fine. So in this particular case, the student joins up on me and his landing gear just mangled. They're just kind of hanging off and broken and that kind of stuff. He came up and joined on me, and even through the canopy and even through his visor, I could see his eyes were as big as saucers. And he joined up and I said, okay, you're okay. We're gonna go back to the base. But I said, see if you can suck up your stubs. And so he pulled up the landing gear and they just kind of partially came up and stuff. Took him back to the field and he landed on the drop tanks and everything was fine.
There were a couple of things I was real proud of as a squadron commander. I was one of the few A-4 squadrons to ever deploy with 27 pilots and come home with 27 pilots. I did not lose a pilot, which I don't think anybody else was able to do that. We got some out of the water, got some of them here, there, and elsewhere, but they made it home, and I was real proud of that. We'd go in across the DMZ into the Laos area, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran right up through Laos. And you go over there and rendezvous with the Air Force FACs. These guys are crazy. They were flying O2s, and they had the white phosphorus rockets on them. These idiots would fly down through there, and they'd looking for targets. They'd find something and call us and ask, what ordnance you got? Well, I got bombs, or I got rockets, or I got whatever. And we went over one day, and this guy was going up and down the trail, and he said, well, I haven't seen anything today. He said, let me drop down here and see if I can draw some fire. I thought, this guy's crazy. And I'll call you back. And he dropped down. Sure enough, got some small. He said, well, there's some of them over in here, and I'm going to hit it with smoke. I thought, this kid is crazy. These were all young first lieutenants and captains, and they were crazy. Nail was his call sign, Nail Fact. I'll never forget that guy. I'll go down there and see somebody shoot at me. I said, man, you're crazy. And that great, but we did do some real good damage. One day I went in there and he said, I was up here yesterday and I saw a big cave in the side of one of these mountains. I got to find it again. He went up and down and he finally found it. He said, I'm going to shoot a rocket in there. Okay. So he fired in. He said, okay, it's about 50 feet above and maybe 50 feet to the right of the smoke. That gave you an aiming point. From where we were, we couldn't see anything up 15, 17,000. So, okay, so we had rockets. And I rolled in, put pepper on this and put it about where I thought it ought to be. And as I got in close enough, I could see it pickled off a Zuni rocket. It went in the cave. And I pulled out, barely missed the mountain on the other side, and turned, looked back, and nothing. Seemed like forever, and all of a sudden the whole side of that mountain went karoom. We had found an ammo dump. And this young fact was he was thrilled to death. Said, nobody's ever gonna believe this. I said, yeah, but you'd ever once find something like that. Evidently, the delay's what got me. I saw the thing go in, and I'm turning, climbing out, and look back at it, nothing's happening, and all of a sudden, karoom, it came out. I said, ooh, that's nice. Had fun that day, but we call that kind of warming up. At that time, there wasn't a lot of heavy stuff in that area.
Well, that's another time too. We took a small arm. We took a hit. We lost all our hydraulics. Didn't seem to be a big issue. Our divert field for the day and where we were located, we went into Ubon, Thailand. And we went to lower the landing gear, which is a manual lowering. And the nose gear came down, the left main came down, but the right main did not come down. So therefore we were in trouble because you can't land the aircraft with a nose gear down in one main because the aircraft will roll when it touches down. The Air Force and Ubon didn't want us fouling the runway, so they told us to give us a heading and told us where the bailout area is, and they said, go eject, we'll pick you up. I'd been a skydiver in college, and I thought, well, maybe if I ever had to eject, it wouldn't be a big deal. No, I didn't want to leave that airplane. Ejecting from an aircraft is always dangerous, but anyway, the only thing we could do is to unjam the landing gear. So I think we did it twice, and we couldn't get it down, where we basically climbed up, got altitude, pointed the nose to the ground, put as much G on the aircraft as we could, trying to G the landing gear down, and it wouldn't come down. We were at this point getting really low on fuel, so we gave it one last chance. We upped the speed some more, we got a little higher, we put as much G on the aircraft we possibly thought we could, and the landing gear finally popped down. And we were landed safely at Ubon. It turned out that a round had gone directly through the uplock mechanism and bent it, and that's where it wouldn't release the landing gear, and that's with no hydraulic pressure, we couldn't get it down. But any landing you walk away from was a good one. The Follow Me trucks in Ubon were really neat. They were Air Force. They followed us into the transient parking area. They actually had beer in the Follow Me truck, and they were throwing beer up to the cockpit, said, hey, you want a beer? That beer tasted really good. And I'm not a beer drinker.
Now later on, after LBJ told us we couldn't bomb up north anymore, they moved everything down to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. and places that we used to go and they didn't even worry about any aircraft or anything. Man, we started getting shot off. We said, what happened? Well, they just moved everything down. They knew we weren't going up north anymore. So some more LBJs doing. Trail, we used to go in sometimes at night and try to find targets and on Highway 1, we called it, which was right on the coast. And we had A3s that'd fly in there and they'd pick up, had IR on there, infrared, that they could pick up targets on the ground. When they did, they said, oh, we got one down here. We go over, drop flares and bomb at night and all that good stuff. And all of a sudden we weren't picking up any. These guys were smart. On their Jeeps and trucks, they built little platforms up above the radiators and engine. The heat was reflected down. We weren't getting any heat reflected up. So that's cheating. But yeah, it's kind of a war in electronics. We called it countermeasures, countermeasures, and countermeasures. If we went through all of this. First on, we got out there, they had SAMs, and we weren't doing anything with it. Somebody got smart and said, well, I don't know how these guys are that smart, but they figured out like the 7th lobe of the L-band radar is what's making this missile go left and right and what have you. I don't know how people are that smart, but they are. So they put this hump on the back of the A-4. It was called shoehorn gear, and they put some little black boxes in there. And what had happened is this L-band radar had hit it, and when it'd send the guidance signal back, it would reverse the 7th lobe or whatever it was, reverse it, so in turning right, it'd turn left. So, aha, we got it made, man. It started going off 500 feet behind us. We got it made. Well, they got smart and said, oh, they're doing that, so we're going to change it to, I think they call it lobe on receive only, somehow or other, guiding the missile. We had to change again. So as I say, it was a measures, countermeasures through the whole war. But that's the way this hump on the back of the airplane came up. That was originally what they call shoehorn. We didn't have room for anything else in A4. They had to put it somewhere. But yeah, that was some real stuff. But yeah, it was a countermeasures thing. Well, fortunately, we kind of kept up with them until essentially it was over. I was glad to see the president finally decided, let's go hit Hanoi. We should have been doing that all the time. All they did was 1 or 2 flights in through there with the B-52s, and they said, oh, now let's talk. We could have done that early on with A4s. We were a lot more accurate than the B-52. B-52 is good for area bombing, but precision bombing was not their big forte, but it scared the heck out of it. When they come in there and lay bombs, it was scary.
There was a lot of AAA and small arms fire everywhere we went in Laos. And we were 300 or 400 feet. We're not hard to hit. We're certainly within the range of anything they want to shoot up at us. But if you constantly kept G on the aircraft, we would fly along the trail, constantly changing our plane, and we would basically crisscross back and forth. Sometimes we'd fly actually inverted and looking straight back up through the canopy, trying to see what we were going to see on the ground. And after enough missions, you got pretty good at what we call reading the trail. You could identify the North Vietnamese from the Pathet Lao. You could see where the trucks were, and sometimes you could develop some really good intelligence on where they hid all those trucks. Again, I think the most exciting thing is when you made things burn. If you were good at what you did, and you guessed right, and you hit those trucks, they would be off the road, very well camouflaged. The North Vietnamese were very good at camouflage. But when you set them on fire, you knew you hit them, and you hit them good. One time, what they would also do is they would, to get fuel and oil down into Laos and into South Vietnam, they would float partially filled POL drums down the river, and they would have collection points. And one of the times, I was able to see where one of these collection points were, where they gathered all these partially POL, these drums that were partially full of gasoline, and where they could float them, and then we'd camouflage and cover them up. Probably one of the biggest fires I ever got is when I discovered where they were hiding all these oil drums and caught them on fire, and it was probably one of the biggest fires that I ever saw in that area. But we heard them that day too. Basically, we had 100 rounds of 20 Mike, which wasn't very effective and didn't last long. And the The big ordnance, we had 5-inch Zunis. We had 2 rocket packs. Generally, we keep 4 smoke and 4 high explosive. And if you use your smoke marking targets, you could always use the HE. If we caught a truck on the trail or something that we thought needed to be destroyed, it was our discretion whether we wanted to go single plane and attack this target. And we would use the high explosive at that point, or just anything we could hit. But we had a lot of leeway on what we could do. And although it was not wise to deal with guns and or sometimes take on the targets, we would just do it anyway because it needed to be destroyed. Now sometimes, if they had an old truck that was damaged, wouldn't move, they would park it where we could see it. And it was like a lure for us to come in, and they'd already have the AAA lined up, and it was basically a trap. So you always had to be cognizant that it could be a trap if it was too good of a target. So they were sneaky and they were good. Well, it's a whole different viewpoint from the front seat from the back seat. And basically, if you're an aircraft commander, everything's on your shoulders, you know. And basically, yeah, the training program was all OJT, it was on-job training. It was, as I said, the Marine Corps was really good in those days at, let's just get the job done. And it was, the pilots basically were recruited because of their attitude that I can do this. Whatever you throw at me, we'll get the job done. And that's what we did. So therefore, when I moved to the front seat and you're aircraft commander, it's up to you to work the airstrikes, to fly the airplane, and maybe train the guy in the back. If on an ideal mission you had a fully trained guy in the back, it made it real easy. The guy in the front just flew the airplane. And it was up to him then to make all the decisions still. The guy in the back would work the airstrikes. The thing about flying in Laos, there were no friendlies there as far as concerned, and we didn't have nearly the rules of engagement that the guys flying north would, or even in South Vietnam. And basically, if there was somebody in Laos that we came across, they were the bad guys. You still had to worry about working the airstrikes. Now, we would check in with an orbiting C-130 called Hillsborough. We would call in and we'd check in when we crossed into Laos. We'd tell them that we were crossing the fence, and therefore they were in Laos. We were on the way out, we'd always say that we were going feet wet. We were exiting and we were crossing the fence the other way, and we'd going back, and then we would check from Hillsborough and we'd go transfer it to another controller. Hillsborough would help us deliver the other aircraft that they would say come and say they were A-7s or F-4s and they had ordnance. Then sometimes we would know ahead of time, and sometimes if you caught a truck or some trucks or road repair crews, you needed ordnance, you'd check with them. They could divert ordnance from other places, hand it off to you, and you would work those guys. So basically, we did have a controlling agency, and it was called Hillsborough. If we had to cap for say somebody that was shot down, you would end up, you'd still check in with Hillsborough. They'd tell you who's coming in. You'd probably work with Sandy's and or the rescue helicopters that come in. Again, I was fortunate I never had to cap for anybody that was shot down.
With the A-4, it was a tactical airplane, and that was one of the things that the students liked and the instructors liked it too. You put the airplane on. You know, I'm not a big guy, 5'10", and I would get in the airplane and you'd roll your shoulders forward, you'd close the canopy up, and you'd press fit yourself back up into the airplane. You wore the airplane. And so the A-4 became very, very comfortable. I flew it for probably close to 1,000 hours through the training command and as a student. And that was the one thing about that airplane, is it was a high performance airplane. That was the first time in a student's career that you really felt that you were doing what you always wanted to do. Because here was an airplane that you learned how to drop bombs and shoot rockets and shoot guns with. You learned how to do formation flying, one and two or two and four airplanes. You learned how to fly mission type oriented sorties, where you would go out and fly can type missions. You'd go out and do ACM, which is air combat maneuvering, dissimilar aircraft flying, where you'd go flying against another airplane. So it was the first step for people to really feel like they were really in the profession. They were becoming professional pilots. Many of our students at that point in time, because the A-4 was a fleet airplane, went and flew the A-4. Many of them went from there and they went and they flew F-4s, F-14s, F-8s, A-6s, and a lot of the other airplanes. So it was a real transformation from a lot of people, because the students had gone from having been in the program not quite a year, 9 months, 8 months. They'd gone from 0 to flying high performance airplanes in a year. You know, so it was a real progression for them, and by the time they finished this, it was an accomplishment. They were flying fleet airplanes. They were flying high performance jet aircraft. And so it was always interesting to watch that progression, because you'd get them in new and you'd do basic airway maneuvers. It was the first time they worked in cockpit simulators, because we had cockpit simulators that actually sort of functioned as simulators. By today's standards, they were very, very rudimentary. It was a cockpit that would motion fore and aft and back and forth, but it sat on the ground. It wasn't one of these big ones on stilts. But it was the first time that students spent a lot of time honing their skills before you'd go out and fly. You built a lot of confidence in them. You take people, and we would go from Kingsville, Texas to California, and other than landing for fuel someplace, they would never see outside. And so that confidence builder of people learning that they can fly an airplane without ever looking outside, just by doing airway navigation and maintaining their scan patterns and things like that. The confidence you would see with them after their first formation flights. Formation flying was a big revelation for a lot of people. You know, had always been told stay away from airplanes, and now we're going to get really, really close. You know, and the whole idea of finding another airplane, being able to join up on it, and then fly around and do tactical type things in different types of formations was always a great awakening for the students with a lot of these things.
You know, when you're in the adversary business, the horizon doesn't matter. It's all relative to the other aircraft that you're fighting, and particularly in the lower performance models, the E model, the TA4J, you're always running out of energy, and so you would, if you had gas, you'd always fight. So the fuel gauge wasn't that big of a deal. But if you're out of energy, then you just say, I'm ballistic, and you just have to wait until the airplane figures out what it wants to do. You may be a tail slide, or you may be doing a flop of some kind going forward, or a tumble, or whatever. You just waited it out until you got airspeed. You went through normal procedures. You'd run the trim down to 0 to 4 degrees so that you could get the flying airspeed back, and then you fought again. And then sometimes, at the end of a fight, the F-14s always ran out of gas first. We would go with a 1V1V1 or 1V many or whatever, with whatever airplanes are still out there with gas. You're up in the vertical, you're out of knots, the airplane's just ballistic, you've called it. But if there's an airplane on top of you that's also ballistic, now you don't know where anybody's going to go, and nobody's in control. And so you're just kind of counting to 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, and if you are still alive, then you did good, and you go back and get your energy up and fight again. You know, whatever happens, happens, and you move on. You never think about the near hits that you had or whatever. You know, it's a moment in time that's gone.
Well, when I got hit in the nose, I really thought I'm gonna have to get out of this thing, but there again, well, the A-4 keeps on flying. A bunch of junk went down, and the engine was running kind of rough, and I lost a lot of avionics because that's all in the nose. But no, really, you don't really have time to think about stuff like that. You just do whatever it takes to correct what happened and go home. But no, we were very lucky. As I say, I did not lose I lost some airplanes, but didn't lose a pilot. If you could make it to the water, well, you were home free. We didn't have automation, but I actually made a don't see anything ever till it stops on the flight deck on the USS Ranger. It was night, raining, visibility, practically nothing. I didn't have enough fuel for what we call a bingo fuel going to Da Nang. And so it's come aboard on CCA, carrier control, radar approach. And we had some of the best controllers on the ship you've ever seen. They picked me up, and down the glide slope I came, and you're right on, glide slope, glide slope, glide slope. They called me at 1 mile, 1/2 mile, I still hadn't seen anything. And before I could say anything, I felt this big thump, and there's never a doubt when you catch a wire. I mean, you either got one or you hadn't, but I caught the wire, had full throttle, and pulled it off. And as I ran forward, I saw the datum lights and the red light go by me on the left. That's the first thing I saw. It was a 0-0 land. Don't want to do that anymore. It was very, very scary. But yeah, we had We flew in some really terrible weather, and it was mainly because we had the best GCA controllers in the world, out of CCA they call them. And I had a whole bunch of pilots that just never thought about flying at night and daytime, whatever. We made instrument approaches nearly every night if it's any kind of weather at all. If it's a nice clear VFR night, sure, you could go in or a downwind pattern around this. It was faster getting the air wing aboard that way, but if you had fuel, it was real nice to do it the other way too. Just like making a straight-in instrument approach, essentially is what it was.
One of the stories I was telling Eric is that I really hadn't told to very many people is that because we loved what we did, we loved the airplane, we loved to fly, a lot of time if you finished your mission early and you had extra gas, you didn't want to take the airplane back home to Da Nang and actually land immediately. You had a multi-million-dollar airplane, you had extra gas, you wanted to go sightseeing. So I was with a good friend of mine named Tom Nelson, who was somewhat of a maverick also. And we were leaving Laos to go back home to Da Nang, and we looked down and we saw the Ashaw Valley. The Ashaw Valley was a very beautiful place. So I asked Tom, you want to go see the Ashaw Valley? And he said, well, sure, let's go. I rolled the airplane inverted, split us, we went down into the valley, and we were cruising low, looking up at both sides. And we were commenting what a beautiful place it was. When they opened up on both sides of these green tracers, just had the airplane bracketed. And the most amazing thing to me, I looked off to my left, and all these green tracers were coming right towards the aircraft. And it's like right before they got to the wingtip, they split. Some of the tracers went above the airplane, some of them went below the airplane. And to this day, I'll swear it was the hand of God reaching out. He split those bullets. Not a scratch on the airplane. So I flew home that day, and I don't think Tom and I ever told anybody. We didn't talk to anybody about it, but it was really stupid, and it made me think of the old saying, it's a good thing God loves small children and stupid Marines. He saved my butt that day.
It's a lot of other people say, God, is it hard to land on a carrier? If you train for it, and that's really all you do, it kind of gets to be old hat. Now, if you don't do it very much, you can get yourself in trouble. It's like anything else if you're proficient in it. I'm going through flight training, and to get out of basic training, primary training, we call it, you had to make 6 carrier landings in the old SNJ T6. And God, I had loved this field carrier landing practice. This was fun. You're flying at 50 feet off the deck. This always great. Well, we go out this little old Jeep carrier. That's what we had in the training command, a 523 feet long Jeep carrier. And I went out there and looked, oh boy, that looks little. Anyway, I got down to the pattern. I was the only one in the fly. I had 6 for 6. 6 approaches, 6 cuts, 6 landings. They sent me home and said, you're qualified. And I thought, man, this is fun. Well, I had put down on my request sheet for advanced training multi-engine. Well, I get to Corpus Christi, and this Marine major was an assignment officer, and he looked at my record and said, ain't no way, Ashmore, that you're going to go multi-engine. I said, why? He said, I've got people that came in, they almost had to shoot down to get them qualified aboard a carrier, and said, you got 6 for 6? No, you're going to be a carrier pilot.
Everything was basically VFR that we did. You really couldn't work. I mean, even though we were low, and on one occasion we were working below an overcast, you couldn't call in airstrikes. You didn't have the room to do it. And basically we were almost sightseeing. And I told Eric again, one of the days it was interesting in that most of us were dual qualified in another aircraft, and the guy I was flying with was an F-4 pilot. And he said, well, we didn't have the aircraft for the missions that day, but he could go borrow an F-4. Did I want to fly in an F-4? So typical Marine Corps fashion, then we went out to the F-4 line, we got an airplane checked out. The plane captain strapped me into the back of an F-4. I'd never been in an F-4 before. And basically just showing me a few basics and where the ejection seat handled when the things went south, and off we launched. Well, we were working below an overcast for no apparent reason, and we were flying down a ridge line, and I'll swear every gun in that area opened up on us. And if you've ever looked down a gun muzzle, it's like somebody pointing sparklers at you. and all these multiple sparklers are pointed at us. And I remember the guy in the front said, well, you need to mark down those things, we'll know those gun positions. And I thought, I know where those fucking gun positions are, they're always there. And I'd never been shot at so much in my life. It was like being in a shooting gallery, except we were the little ducks and we were lined up and we were given the North Vietnamese free target practice that day. How we ever made it home that day, I'll never know, because the F4 smoked really bad and they could see us coming from a mile away, miles away.
Probably the best fight that I ever had was myself versus a friend in F-18. I was flying, could have been this very airplane. And we went out, it was strictly a knife fight. We're just visual guns only, basically. And neither of us could get a shot. It was that close. You know, you're just pretty much canopy turning, trying to get slow, forcing somebody out in front, but both of us were experienced enough where we didn't let that happen. And that's probably the biggest thing that we were trying to teach, was keep your energy up and avoid that kind of a situation, because you're probably going to lose. And in most cases, if you saw a big bat turn, whether it was on an F-18 or on an F-16, and all the vapors coming off the wings, then you know it's going to be a short fight, because usually they're out of energy. They can't turn the same way that the A-4 can. We could do a loop at 200 knots if you really worked at it. So 250 knots was a better speed for doing a loop, but you could go over the top at 200 knots. That works out pretty well.
I say we were full of beans. Basically, we were all supremely confident in our abilities and what we could do. And I think there wasn't any challenge that we thought we couldn't overcome. And it was, for a young man, it was the most exciting thing in the world to do. You did get tired of somebody trying to kill you on a daily basis, but it's something you wanted to do because you were meant to be there. I just want to say how privileged I was to have flown the Marine Corps, to have been given the opportunities that I was given. They're probably some of the most important years of my life, to have flown the Marine Corps, and actually to have been a combat pilot. Even if I'd have never come home, it was worth every minute of it. And I want to thank my country and the United States Marine Corps.